This lesson is on finding the degree measure of an angle when you're given the sine, cosine, or tangent. And if you remember, that's called your inverse sine or inverse cosine or inverse tangent. All right, so we'll say like sine to the -1, cosine to the -1, tangent to the -1. So for this lesson, I'm going to give you a value for a cosine, sine, or tangent, and you're going to give back the angle. So the first, we're going to talk about inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. All right, and they look like this. So this is inverse tangent, inverse cosine, and inverse sine, and that's what they look like. If you remember, sine, cosine, and tangent can be positive or negative, and that means you live in a certain quadrant. So if your sine is positive, we're going to write our answer. So it's between negative 90 degrees and 90 degrees, or negative, which is the same as negative pi halves and pi halves. So if I have a negative sign, I'm going to put an angle here. If I have a positive sign, I'm going to pick an angle there. If I have an angle in quadrant 4, I'll write it as a negative, so like negative 30, negative 60, something like that. If I'm in quadrant 1, then I'll just do 30, 60, whatever. For inverse cosine, if I'm positive, I'm still in quadrant 1, but negative, I'm going to do quadrant 2, and that's between 0 and 80, or 0 and pi, and we write it positive. So like if it's negative, we'll write 120 degrees. If it's positive, then we're talking 60 degrees. And then inverse tangent, if it's positive, it's going to lie in this quadrant, and again, if it's negative, it'll lie in this quadrant, just like sine. All right, so we're going to do some examples. I'm going to give you the cosine of a value or a sine of an angle, and then you're going to give back the angle. Okay, so we're going to do some examples. So we're going to do inverse cosine square root of 3 over 2. Then we're going to do inverse sine square root of 3 over 2. And then we're going to do inverse sine negative half. Let's do a tangent one. Let's do cosine of 0. Inverse cosine of negative 1/2. And then finally, let's do one of these equations. Sine theta equals negative 0.6. All right. So I look at that table I told you to memorize from the previous notes, where we wrote down all the sine, cosine, and tangents for our reference angles, all right, for 30, 60, 45. Again, when I told you to memorize it, because now we're going to work in reverse. So now we're going to look at a table, find out what has the cosine of square root of 3 over 2, and write down that angle. Since I'm positive, I'm going to use a reference angle. I'm going to be in quadrant 1. All right, and the angle that has a cosine of square root of 3 over 2 is 30 degrees, or if we're asking for radians, pi 6. Again, I copied that right from the table from the previous notes. What angle has a sine of square root of 3 over 2, and again we're positive, so we're quadrant 1, is 60 degrees, or pi thirds. So again, just looking at the table, working in reverse, working the inverse. Now I have what angle has a sine of negative 1/2? Now I'm in sine and I'm negative, so I have to be in quadrant 4. All right, quadrant 4, so I'm going to be a negative angle. 30 degrees has a sign of 1/2, so negative 30 degrees has the sign of negative 1/2, or negative pi 6. Now we're going to do tangent 1, and I'm negative, so I'm going to be in quadrant 4. 45 degrees has a tangent of 1, so negative 45 degrees has the tangent of negative 1, or we could put negative pi fourths. Cosine is 0. We didn't talk about 0, but we're talking about then right on the axis. And if we look at our table, what has a cosine of 0? That would be 90 degrees. Okay, we want to be in that shaded area, so we won't do 270. So we're going to do 90 degrees, or pi halves. Now we have a cosine that's negative. So if we cosine the negative, we're going to be in quadrant 2. The angle that has a cosine of 1/2 is 60. All right, so if I want to know what angle that matches up to in quadrant 2, I do 180 minus 60, which is 120 degrees, or in radians, 2 pi thirds. All right, so now we have an equation, and let's say I want to find the value of theta for this equation. My sign is negative, okay, so I know I'm going to be between 90 or negative 90 and 90 degrees. If they give you something like this where it's not from that chart, then you're going to use the inverse sine function in the calculator. So I'm going to type in sine inverse 1 of negative 0.6 into the calculator. So I'm going to do that. So second sine negative 0.6. I want to make sure I'm in degree mode, because I think this one's asking for degree, which I wasn't, so let's try this again. Oh my god, I'm still not in degree mode. Oh Lord. Okay, degree mode. Second enter. Negative 36.8, let's say 7 degrees. Okay, so this lesson's pretty short. It's just inverse, meaning I'm going to give you the value of sine, cosine, or tangent, and then you give me back the angle using the chart, or if they give you like a decimal or something that's not in the chart, using the calculator.